welcome everybody to the final webinar for the 24th Wimmera Biodiversity Seminar. We hope you've had a chance to join in on the previous 4 weeks of webinars and that you've enjoyed the presentations so far. The theme for this year's seminar is farming and biodiversity. We're focusing on one of the most important actors in the preservation and restoration of biodiversity within our region. I'd like to start with an acknowledgement of country, and I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of all the lands wherever we join the seminar from today. I'm participating from Horsham, Victoria, which is a land of the Watchabolik, Jardwa, Jardwa-Jali, Wagaya and Japagok peoples. I extend my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and any other elders who may be joining us here today. I give recognition to their proud traditions, vibrant culture and continued connection to land, water and the community. And I'd also like to invite participants to put in the chat what country they're joining from today. My name's Caitlin. I'm part of the organising committee and I work for Grampians Wimmera Mallee Water. I'd like to thank our organising committee just for your tremendous work with organising yet again another online seminar. I know it's quite hard in these times to continue to plan events and keep things going, but you know, you guys have pulled together another fantastic seminar, a 2nd year in a row, so props to everyone working behind the scene. I'd like to thank our sponsors today, which are Bank Australia, Barangi Gadgin Land Council, Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning, Grampians Wimmera Mallee Water, Wimmera CMA and Trust for Nature. I'd like to inform participants that we will be recording the webinar today and that the recording will be available via the Swift Vic YouTube channel. If you have any questions for our presenters today, please pop them in the chat box. If you're joining us via YouTube, you won't actually be able to ask questions directly on the stream, but you can still send any questions that you have for our presenters to our email, which is wimmerabiodiversityseminar@hotmail.com, or you can direct message us on any of our social media platforms. If you're having any technical issues with the stream, you can also contact us on those same platforms. So with all that housekeeping out of the way, I'll move on to introducing our first speakers for today from Greening Australia, which is Jess Gardner and Zoe Burney. Jess Gardner is a senior ecologist with Greening Australia and has been planning and delivering restoration outcomes for over 15 years in the Wimmera and Mallee. Jess credits growing up on a farm involved in land care with inspiring her interest in a career in natural resource management. She spent some time working as a technical lab assistant with the Department of Agriculture and then went on to do a degree in NRM. She started with Greening Australia in 2005 as a scientific research and extension officer and has moved about the business in different roles since. Zoe Burney is a technical lead in the science and planning team at Greening Australia and is passionate about protecting biodiversity and increasing ecosystems' resilience to the impacts of climate change. Zoe's worked at Greening Australia for 2 years and has worked on various projects, including restoration activities at the Bank Australia Conservation Reserve, Project Phoenix, and in the Yarra Valley on restoration projects for the critically endangered helmeted honeyeater and lowland leadbeater possum. So with those introductions out of the way, I'll pass over to you both, Jess and Zoe. Take it away.
Thanks, Caitlin. I'll just share my screen so Jess can kick us off. Hopefully that you can see that. Great.
G'day everyone, and thanks so much for having us. I'd also like to acknowledge the First Nations Watchabolik, Jardwa, Jardwa-Jali, Wagaya and Japagok peoples. Pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. It's an absolute privilege to work and learn from your people here in the Wimmera. Today, Zoe and I wanted to share with you a project that we've worked on together at Ozcadnock in the West Wimmera. We were fortunate enough to sneak this fieldwork in before the lockdowns back in July, where we achieved 60 hectares of direct seeding of predominantly understory shrub species into an older, sort of less biodiverse planting. So we had the goal of enhancing the biodiversity values of this area. But in addition, we wanted to ensure that our work would be able to survive the many challenges of the future under climate change scenarios. So hence, we adopted a climate-adjusted approach to the sourcing of the seed. Thanks, Zoe. Next slide. Yes, so today's presentation, first Zoe and I are going to attempt to co-present, our first time doing this online as well. So hopefully we go okay. But for a start, we'll just briefly talk about Greening Australia and our goals. And then why do we need climate-adjusted approaches? And then we'll go into more detail of the actual project that we worked on, where we established climate-adjusted direct seeding trial at the Bank Australia Conservation Reserve.
Great. Thanks, Jess. So Greening Australia is a national environmental enterprise, and we restore Australia's unique landscapes and protect biodiversity with science-led on-ground solutions based on almost 40 years of experience. At Greening Australia, we believe that people thrive when nature thrives, and we're dedicated to restoring land in ways that work for nature, economies, and communities. Our Great Southern Landscapes program that Jess and I work under spans from the east coast to the west and has some really ambitious 2030 goals that will help us achieve our vision. So this includes restoring 300,000 hectares of habitat, conserving 17 flagship threatened species, and becoming Australia's largest carbon sink by sequestering 3 million tonnes of carbon per annum. As we all know, restoring degraded and fragmented land has its challenges. And we know that our climate is changing and that this is putting extra pressure on Australia's plants, animals, and ecosystems. As the climate changes, we know that many places are likely to change. Some plants and animals might decline, others may move, and some may even increase. We know that some forests may decline and some systems may transform. Australia is home to unique species and landscapes, so it's really important that we help these places become more resilient to the impacts of climate change so that future generations can enjoy them like we have. The latest IPCC report provided another stark reminder that the challenge of climate change and the changes to our climate may occur at a faster rate than we previously predicted. So these are just some of the images from the AR6 report, and they just highlight some of these changes under climate change under the three warming scenarios. So we can see in these images that Australia is predicted to become hotter and drier across across all of the warming scenarios.
So yeah, thanks, Zoe. This can all seem rather daunting, overwhelming even at times. But fortunately, there are some really good regional resources that we can all access when planning our projects. So one of the great website to visit is the climatechange.vic.gov.au, and you can also look at regional climate projections in there. So what we do with some high confidence know about the Wimmera in particular is that maximum and minimum daily temperatures are very likely to increase. Rainfall is likely to decline over winter and spring. There's some low confidence that there'll be a change in the autumn rainfall, but anyone who has worked in or lives in the Wimmera for the last decade we don't really get an autumn break anymore. So that's probably likely to continue. Extreme rainfall events. So, and that could even be over summer, as we're already starting to experience that kind of thing in the last decade. So what they're predicting is that, like, the climate of Horsham by the 2050s could be more like the current climate of Deniliquin. Thanks, Zoe. But in this next slide, I wanted to talk about landscape connectivity here and why it's so important in the face of climate changes. Because in a connected landscape, the plants and animals would naturally interact, meaning that genetic diversity would be strong, and therefore a variety of different survival traits would exist within populations, making them more resilient to changes. In this map that I've got up here, the green shows generally what habitat we do have. So our major national parks, state parks, private land reserves. The orange is showing one scenario of the work we would need to do to achieve connectivity, again, in the landscape. So in this scenario, we're not planning to restore everything. It's an agricultural landscape as well, but this is likely what we need to do to restore that connectivity. There's a lot to do, and we're not quite there. So we need to intervene to assist that genetic exchange across the landscape. Thanks, Zoe.
Thanks, Jess. So as Jess said, it can all be quite overwhelming to think about these really big challenges that we have in front of us. But the good news is we can help nature, and everyone has a role to play. So on the screen, you can see a list of 10 actions that we can all take to help nature adapt to a changing climate. And these were developed by the Vic Nature 2050 partnership. The climate-adjusted direct seeding that we're discussing today is an example of using climate-ready plants in restoration to connect landscapes and increase the resilience of that area to the impacts of climate change, which is a nice segue to jumping into that. Thanks, Jess.
Okay, so yeah, here at Greening Australia, we're now incorporating a climate-adapted approach to sourcing our seed and seedlings into the majority of our restoration projects, because we want the work we're doing now to persist well into the future. I'll jump right now into the specific background of the project we just implemented this year. Greening Australia, Trust for Nature and Barinji Gadgin Land Council, we manage a reserve in the West Wimmera on behalf of Bank Australia. We've been doing that since 2016. So the reserve is located, it's spread across 3 properties. Actually, just last week, there was an announcement of a 4th property up in that gap between the east and west blocks of the Little Desert. But this particular project, where we're wanting to enhance the older restoration sites, is that most southern property you can see there. Thanks, Zoe. So this particular property is 236 hectares, mainly on undulating sands, which underpin the flora and fauna we find there. It's predominantly heathy, herb-rich woodland, which provides important habitat and structure for a number of threatened animals. Just to name a few, there's the hooded robin, brown tree creeper, the red-tailed black cockatoo, bearded dragons. But as I mentioned at the very beginning of our talk, that the challenge we have in this particular situation is that this site has already been planted to trees. However, much of the understory and mid-story layers are missing. So really, I suppose I was trying to show with these two photos here is that it's quite a challenge to have an existing treed area and try to push it in the direction more of that right-hand picture.
Great. So when we were planning this project, we followed the broad steps that are outlined in the guidelines for building a climate future plot. So this moves through steps like defining goals of the project, to understanding the climate projections of your area, choosing the plant species, so on and so forth. So the goals of our direct seeding project were to increase the structural and species diversity of the revegetated area that you saw in that photo, that's predominantly just overstory gums. The other goal was to enhance the climate resilience of a revegetation project by sourcing 10 to 20% of seed from a range of locations that currently experience the climatic conditions predicted to occur at Ozenkadnock in 2030 and 2050. So with our goals defined, the next step was to understand the climate projections for Ozenkadnock. To do this, we used the Climate Analogues Explorer. Under a high emission scenario of RCP 8.5, Horsham's temperature, Horsham's the closest area that we could use to the reserve, temperature and rainfall is projected to be similar to places like Shepparton and Warracknabeal in 2030 and Pinnaroo and Griffith in 2070. So this means that approximately 20% of the climate adjusted seeds for the project needs to come from hotter and drier locations. And as a risk-based approach, we also source 10% of seed from cooler and wetter scenarios because we have less certainty around the altered rainfall patterns under climate scenarios.
So yeah, but that's about your video feed to them.
So in line with our goal to enhance the species diversity and structure of this area, we selected a combination of around 14 mid and understory species from the heathy herb-rich woodland EVC and woody shrubs that are commonly used in direct seeding in the region. So this included wattles, she oaks, tea trees and hotbush species. And these species were also assessed as suitable candidates as they grow to around 2+ meters and can be sourced from populations with good genetic variation. So looking at populations, with a couple of hundred individuals. So for each target species, we source seed from 4 broad provenances, 2030, 2050, and then the cooler, wetter. And we also sourced 70% of our seed from those local areas. So broadly following the 70-20-10 rule. The purpose of this design is to maintain as much locally adapted genetic material as possible. We know that there's obviously a lot of local adaptation in populations, and we wanted to make sure that that persists as well. But at the same time, we wanted to bring in new genetics to make sure the local populations are more robust in future hotter and drier conditions. So this strategy reduces potential risks associated with genetic material from a wide geographic range where the translocated species may not be adapted to some of those localized conditions. We also did some site refinement, and when refining the site, we considered any prevailing environmental, site management or disturbance differences across the project area. So this included looking at things like existing overstory vegetation that you saw in those images that were planted in 2011 and 2012, and other features like soil classification, slope and topography. The soil mapping, which you can see in this middle image, is relatively homogeneous across the site, and slope and topography were also minimal across the site. So the main influence we suspect is on growth and survival of understory species is likely to be the existing revegetation across the project area. So things like competition and microclimates. So we decided that we will arrange plots stratified across the 4 broad revegetation areas, which we hope will mean that we capture any minor slight differences like topography and slope. So these were our 4 broad areas that we revegetated. Thanks, Jess.
Thanks, Zoe. So the project was not without its challenges, even though we have all these tools and planning behind us, which I think is important to share as well. So I think as a first challenge, as local practitioners, we have our established networks in place, and we're familiar with obtaining good quality local provenance collections. The climate adjusted approach actually requires us to broaden our networks or link in with other networks. Also, many species that we may be interested in using this approach, they might already be at their northern extent of their range, or their natural range might be quite small anyway. Also, the climate analogue modelling is fantastic, but it may not be sensible to historic genetic exchange, as it's looking at temperature and climatic factors rather than natural gene flow pathways. For example, on the analogue model on the right in that image, you can see that there's drawing lines to the Wimmera may have similar temperatures to over in places in WA. But of course, we're not going to source our seed from there. So it requires a combination of science and common sense. So the other challenge, which many of us will be familiar with, is that we're restrained often by our budgets and funding. Small amounts of specific provenance seeds, it may not be feasible to send someone out to collect specifically in the wild, unless you've got a fantastic budget and time frame to do that. And that was actually the case by what we experienced in our project, but we very quickly realised we probably underestimated that we couldn't do everything we wanted to do. And so we were limited by what we were able to purchase from other seed banks in this particular project.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, not sure. Doesn't want to move to the next slide. Yep, there we go.
Oh, there we go. So what did we end up doing? We used our network. So you can see in the map I've done there, we sourced our 2050 adjusted seed from that general region in South Australia as well. 2030 we were able to get seed from the Project High Marsh area, and also accessing seed through Seeding Victoria. We did undertake a local collection, as per usual, and we were able to access some seed from Greening Australia's Portland Seed Bank, and also another business down there that we know that collects seed called Direct Seed. So yeah, I guess again, it's that combination of science and planning, common sense, and using our networks to try to implement these guidelines. Thanks, Zoe.
Great. So once we did have all of our seed, it was time for us to implement on the ground, and I was fortunate enough to escape up to the Wimmera in between the Metro Melbourne lockdowns to help Jess out with this direct seeding, which was really fun. So our plots were arrayed in adjacent rows and alternated, as I've tried to show here, to allow for mixing of provenances over time. So once they start setting seed and that sort of thing. We sowed at least 8 replicates of 200-metre plots for each provenance within the project area. And these plots were set up so that we can monitor them over time to evaluate the success of these different provenances and do some comparisons. So for each plot, we marked out the start and end point of each 200-metre line and took GPS coordinates. We also noted things like the site preparation and any other relevant environmental factors. We did have high hopes of using our Field Maps app on the day to plug in all of this data, but unfortunately we had some technological hiccups on the day, so we had to revert back to the old pen and paper method, but hopefully we can get this up and running when we go back to monitor. So this picture you can see here is Jess with a couple of our plots all marked out, and I think this is just a good way to show how we implemented it on site, sort of manoeuvring through this existing revegetation. Once we had sown our trial plots, we sowed the rest of the seed across the site in line with that 70%, 20%, 10% guidance. We haven't started our monitoring yet, but we do have a plan for that. So monitoring of the plots should occur annually after summer for the first few years, and then yearly after that. So we also decided that the site should be checked after major weather events or disturbances to record any impacts or variation in survival across those different provenance groups. The key outcome of our monitoring is to be able to make comparisons between the local and climate adjusted seed to understand if any of them are performing better over time. In the early years, we would use indicators like plant survival and growth, and then as the plants mature, we would incorporate other factors like flowering, time, and seed set. Through what I think is important to note here, I guess, is that thorough mapping and the marking of plots are really essential in setting up a trial like this. It makes the ongoing monitoring and data collection a lot easier, especially if the assessments are set up to, for a long-term monitoring and evaluation procedure. So in that time, there may be different people going out and monitoring it from those who set it up. So marking out the plots and having all that mapping done is just extremely helpful. Once the plants start to grow as well, it can also become hard to see exactly where you did sow those lines. So accurate maps are, again, just really helpful. So these are just a couple of examples of how we might monitor the direct seeding lines. So things like setting up transects and then having plots within those transects and monitoring presence-absence data as well on either side of the plot, just to pick up things like the existing revegetation that was there when we sowed. So that brings us to the end of the presentation, and these are just some of the tools and resources that we use through this project and that we think would be helpful for anyone else wanting to plan and implement a project like this. So thank you, and happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thanks, Zoe, and thanks, Jess, for that really great presentation. You guys are doing really incredible work, and it's great to have, that future lens from the outset for these type of projects. So there are a couple questions in the chat for you guys. First one, what about enhancing the biodiversity on the agricultural lands? There are ways of increasing Indigenous biodiversity within agricultural lands. They don't have to be total monocultures. Agroecological approaches are possible as more diverse smaller farms have great potential, at least in some situations. So I guess that's probably more of a comment than a question, but if you guys wanted to speak to that, go ahead. But if not, we can move on.
Jess, did you want to take a hit at that one?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. Thanks for that comment. And absolutely, we do need to enhance biodiversity on farms, and we certainly do. This is just one example of many different types of project sites that we have in the Wimmera and elsewhere.
Awesome. Thanks, Jess. What about the origin of the reserve name? Where did that come from?
Ozenkatnook. I believe it's the district. Probably needs to be looked at the name of the reserve there, because it's actually it's a district name. Yeah.
And we just have one more comment. Would love to hear from you again in 5, 10, 15 years to see the difference made to this site. It is a question. Will you include monitoring birds and other animals to measure the success of providing habitat or food for native fauna, as well as invasive species?
Happy to answer again, Zoe, if you are.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, we had multiple goals for this project, and one of the key ones was to enhance the biodiversity values of this area, improve the biodiversity values. So, of course, that includes looking at what species will be utilising that new habitat, and as well as, monitoring has, using the climate-adjusted approach, benefited how fit for survival that area is into the future. So yes, there will be lots more monitoring to do, and we look forward to sharing those results in the future.
Yeah. Awesome. Definitely not a short process by any means.
I think probably it's going to be, realistically, year 5 might be quite interesting. There could be some short-term interesting results, but I think in general a revegetation site in the Wimmera takes around that long to start to show different traits and what value, apart from birds that might come in immediately, what habitat values it will provide.
Yeah. A few more questions for you guys. How easy will it be for small-scale re-veg projects to use this same method and monitoring?
Did you want to answer that one, Zoe?
Yeah, I think, as Jess highlighted, the key things, I suppose, are accessing that seed from the different areas. So one thing, I guess, that you could do is try to look at if you could collect seed for multiple projects that are potentially coming up, so that you can increase the size of that order, or look to buying already collected lots from seed banks. But the planning process is suitable, I guess, across different scales. So if you're doing a 1 hectare plot, or a 60 hectare plot like we did, you would follow the same process. It's probably just the ability to get your hands on that on that seed. It's the tricky part, but will become hopefully easier over time.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I agree, Zoe. Perhaps one solution is that we pool all of our projects so that we're combining our resources to achieve getting the seed that we need each year.
Is this a dune and swale system?
Yes, yeah. A lot of the herb-rich heathy woodlands are on those dune systems, north-south. This particular property doesn't have much of the swale on it. That's, pushing into the neighbouring farmland there.
Yeah, let's just leave it like that.
Got one more question, then we might leave it at that for you guys. Are you looking at pollinators, insects, and soil microbiology as the re-veg evolves? So many factors to consider. The future proofing of biodiverse re-veg is very complex.
Yeah, I think definitely as the vegetation, I guess, matures, as Jess mentioned, at least, at the 5-year plus mark, we'd love to look at all of that. But those are, I guess, not things that we typically measure as standard practice, but hopefully we can do that for some of these projects. But at the moment, we haven't planned for that as yet.
Yeah, and I guess you guys have to have the resources and stuff there to do that stuff in the first place. And like Jess said, having that funding available is kind of hard, I guess. Thank you so much for your presentation, guys. Well done. I would like to introduce our second presenter for today. I'd like to introduce Stephen Hobbs. So Stephen is a 4th generation farmer at Kaniva in the West Wimmera region of Victoria. His property is a mixed farm enterprise producing a variety of crops complemented with a self-replacing merino ewe flock and prime lamb production. Feeling the impacts of increased climate variability, Stephen undertook a process to rethink the farm enterprise mix. He says agriculture is facing its biggest challenge in history, to produce as much food in the next 50 years as has been produced in all of history. With that, I'd like to throw over to you, Stephen, to take it away.
Thank you very much. Now I'll just open the tray. Now hopefully this will...
Yep, we can see that.
Very good. No, thank you for that. When I was asked to speak, I'm quite honoured that you asked me to talk about what we're doing on the farm, but it's been something that I've grappled with for quite some time as to the changing conditions, and I was thinking about it the other day and reflecting the dust storms that we had back in the 80s, the 82 drought. Had quite a significant impact on agriculture, and it got farmers to change what they were doing, to go from conventional cultivation and set stocking, to change the way that we were doing it, and to move to systems that were less prone to erosion and a lot more friendly and in alignment with meeting the challenges of the changing environment. And I guess it's exactly the same thought. And so really I wanted to start with the question of why. So what led to the decision to make the changes? And then I'd like to follow that with about what conclusions did I come to, and then thinking about then how to make a start, because that's always the daunting part of anything, is knowing where to start and how to start. And then I wanted to follow that then with to give you some pictures of some of the observations of the changes that we're making. So why? What led to the decision to make changes? So this is this is it. So if you look at that rainfall graph there on the right, that's basically an overview of the rainfall that we've experienced in this district. Now, I can't put claim to having records from the farm that went back that far. I started collecting rainfall records on the farm in 1980. Prior to that, Grandpa and Dad would just go out to the rain gate. Oh yeah, we've had that much, and then out and never recorded it. But I was fortunate that a friend of mine who was working at the NAB in Conniva, he was told to tidy up the office, and he came across a rainfall records held by the bank, which went back to the mid 1880s. So I used that in my data set up until 1979, and then I put our own data in there from 1980. But really what I was looking for was a trend. Because, you know, talking to the old fellas, they talk about how dry it was and how bad it was in previous droughts, and I just didn't really know if it was or not. So I decided to have a look and see exactly what it was like. So when I talked to the old boys about what were the bad droughts, you can see that from the 1900s there through to 1980, we have a number of dots in that 200 to 300 mil band rainfall, and they are the droughts of legend that happened in the old days. So I use that as my benchmark, I guess, somewhere between 200 and 300 is regarded as a drought. And then when I started looking at my data set, I could see that from about 1990 onwards, I've only ever experienced an average year once or twice, one above average rainfall year. But I could see that there'd been quite a significant change in our rainfall. And then when we started to dig deeper into those figures, you could see that since 1990 compared to the 135-year average, so that red line is our 135-year average, which is 420 millimetres growing season rainfall. Annual rainfall. There's been a 20% decline since 1990 in our annual rainfall, but we can deal with that as long as we get the rain at the right time, and that's really what it comes down to in agriculture, is having the rainfall at the right time. But we can see that most of that rainfall has actually come out of our growing season, which makes things a little bit rough. And we can see that if we then average our growing season over our April to October, months, we've dropped from 44 millimetres on average to 35. Now, what is interesting also too, once you start counting up those drought years, that from 1900 right through to the 90s, not the start of the 90s, there was on average one drought in 10. And since 1990 and the millennium drought really bumped this up, but we averaged a drought 1 year in 3. Now, it's interesting that historically following every drought, there was either average or above average rainfall for several years to recharge the soil moisture, but as you can see, that really hasn't been the since. Jess made a good comment too about the break, and I tend to agree with her that we don't really have a break. One time he used to regard the break as being a rainfall event in April, generally Anzac Day, of an inch. And now we have to change that definition to a rainfall of consecutive days that amounts to more than 15 millimetres. And that generally occurs around about the 28th of May. The other thing that makes things a bit more difficult is we've had a big increase in the frost season, doubling on average. So from our first frost to our last frost, it only used to be around about 90 days. On average now we've got it to 138. The latest frost we've ever experienced was the 1st of November. And then there's also the flip side of that, are our warmer temperatures. And since I've had the weather station recording data or collecting data in 2014, we can I can see that days of 32 degrees or above are still occurring in April, which is supposed to be the start of our growing season, and we're still getting those warm days and starting in October. So when you take all that into consideration, effectively our growing season has shortened. So taking all this information into consideration, these are the sorts of conclusions that we came to. So in consideration of climate change and the changing weather conditions, we could see that the growing season has effectively shortened. We've lost around about, I'd say, between 3 and 5 weeks of our growing season. Another thing that became very obvious once we started looking at things in a little more detail is that where I am, the cost of growing crops is too high in proportion to the risk. And the other component of that is that because of the increased climate variability, we really rely on our springs and we rely on the rainfall that we get. We can have some fantastic looking crops, but if the season rainfall starts to taper off, or we start to get some warm days or a frost, it affects our yield and our quality. Now, it's interesting, looking at this, it became very obvious that I needed to move into more livestock, and I had a big problem with that because I don't like sheep. It sounds a bit ironic, but I really don't. It's a lot nicer sitting on a tractor seat listening to podcasts and things like that. But from a financial perspective, the most sensible thing was to reduce my exposure to risk by changing the cropping sheep ratio. So we've gone from a system where we've been more heavily weighted towards crops to more heavily weighted towards sheep. The good thing about that is that weeds are still pretty good to eat, actually. You don't want them to set seed, of course, but while they're young and growing and green, they're pretty good sheep feed. And the other point to note as well too is climatising things. And Jess was talking about that, about their species, and also too we need to do that same thing with our animals. So we wanted to select, if I was going to run sheep, I wanted to select animals that were more suited to our conditions here. So these then are some further points about things that I need to do to reduce my risk, and they include rotational grazing, and I really need to get a supply of perennial grasses to keep that feed happening all year round, and that could be through a combination of either sowing pastures, but I really like regenerating pastures because that's cheap, you don't have to sow them, and Cole talked about that last week. And Graham Hand is very big on that as well too, about regenerating our seed bank through proper management. One of the other objectives is then I want to maintain more ground cover and to carry more feed over into the summer. And not only am I creating a feed bank for my animals above ground, I'm also creating a feed bank for my animals below ground, which is really important. Now, another idea too, a key point too, is I want to run less sheep, but I want each sheep to be more profitable. And I also want the ability to be able to destock in response, or actually I wanted to start destocking before a drought came in, and so it became really important to look at those rainfall records, look at the odds, listen to the forecasts, but then also to know which sheep I should start to sell. So that's where individual EID management became really important. Something that's going to be an opportunity too is being able to diversify our income and obtain an income stream through soil carbon and carbon neutral produce. And there seems to be a real push towards this, especially in Europe, with going towards carbon neutrality. So I think that's that is something that is a real opportunity and will open itself up to us as time goes on. But also importantly too is that changing your system is really good, but it costs money, and if we don't have a way of helping to offset those costs, we need to do it in a staggered way. So not only did I want to reduce my cost of doing business, I suppose, and the cost of transitioning, but I just wanted to do the stuff that was cheapest and the most easiest stuff. I mean, there's no point in tackling something that's really hard and then you get disappointed if you're not able to achieve that. So you can see there one of my key objectives was to identify and keep the best performing individuals, to sell the underperformers, and to be able to keep those best animals and to destock to market prices. So that brings us up to working out what to change first. So Graham Hand is really good on this, and there are a number of other practitioners with holistic management, but I'd urge you to to do something in that vein, because holistic management is one of those key things that gets you to look at everything rather than looking at one thing in isolation. We need to start managing for a whole. I mean, everything is diverse. We have a diverse mixture, or have diverse species in our crops, and our systems, our business systems, are also quite diverse, and there's a lot of things that affect anything those decisions that we make, and the impacts can flow onto other things as well too. But talking with Graham, looking at things, for me, some of my barriers were knowledge, know-how, and education. And I soon began to realise that knowing the right question to ask is more important than knowing the answer, because sometimes if you don't ask the question, you don't know how to change. The next point was the cost of change, and I touched on that briefly before. But it's being able to say, okay, I need to change, but I've only got X amount of dollars. There's only X amount of time in the day, and I haven't worked out how to clone myself. So it's about understanding what resources you have, what things you can access, but also it's important to understand your limitations as well. And the last point, that's a real big one, is what if it doesn't work? It's a real key one, and it stopped me from doing a lot of stuff, because my experiences of handling sheep in the past weren't, I think it'd be fair to say, weren't very positive. And so moving towards more livestock, just from an experience perspective, wasn't something I was looking forward to do. But really, it really comes down to, because it didn't work in the past doesn't mean it won't work in the future. So just to give you an example of that, with the sheep, for example, this is just to give you a bit of an idea of my thought process of how I want to move towards managing those sheep. I wanted identified the things that I wanted to do, and then I started off with the easiest stuff first. So the easy stuff was to collect ewe weights after scanning, and then when I sent that information through to Elise to do the analysis for me, all of a sudden we knew what our ewe weights were, and Elise could then calculate the fertility and the fecundity, or the number of fetuses per 100 ewes. And that's really powerful. All of a sudden, potentially how many lambs you could have from your fetus count. You also then know what your most fertile weight range is for your ewes, and that then allows you to split your animals up and to manage them. And then we can progress further to the right, where we can start looking at our weights and our traits, our growth rates and fleece, and then use that to calculate our overall income generated per ewe. Taking these things into consideration and some of the changes that I've made. So what am I starting to see on the farm? So in relation to pastures, we have some lucerne pastures and perennial pastures that we've sown. This one here now is just 20 years old, and it was starting to look a little bit thin on the ground, but by changing our management, we've sort of been able to rejuvenate it a bit and get it going, and it's fantastic having that green grass over the summer months. So it's something that I'll be working towards in the future. Certainly by no means do I have anything down pat. I'm probably making more mistakes than I ever had, but it's been great because I'm learning from them. And it's a process of change, and don't think that whatever you do is going to be perfect, or you're not going to do something until it's perfect, because it never will be. So that'll stop you from doing something. So my words of encouragement would be to just have a go. With maintaining greater cover. So this now, I'm starting here to use a little bit of some cover cropping. And so I'll just sow a multi-species mix, get it established, and then get multiple grazings out of it, and then let it seed. Keep it over the summer months, and then and it's quite amazing. If you happen to jag a bit of a thunderstorm or some summer rainfall, it's quite amazing the green feed that you can actually get from an annual crop, and you can sort of treat it as a pretend perennial. And it's really good because we're autumn lambers, and so having that extra cover is really good too in the autumn. Newborn lambs can get amongst all that and shelter, and maintains good cover. And so this is delving into cover cropping now. We're sort of aiming to use more than 10 species in a mix. It can be expensive if you have to buy it, so I generally like to try and use whatever seed I have on hand and available to me in the mix. So a lot of my mixes will just be oats, barley, cereal rye, peas, vetch. I just go through the barn and have a look, see what's left over, chuck in some lupins, and we tried some tillage radish and some turnips, and you can see that's my youngest daughter Becky there, with some tillage radish and turnip. And it was quite funny because Dad was up one day and he said, "Oh, what's that stuff you got growing in the paddock?" And I told him, and he sort of ducked off, and I didn't see much more of him. And anyhow, next week when he came back, he bought a pot of turnip stew. And it's quite funny, but it didn't taste too bad actually. It was quite good. And so the idea with the cover crops then, you can see an example of the different seeds in the mix there up in the top right hand, and sow it and basically grow it, and then the idea then is to have your high stocking numbers and trample it down, but I was quite amazed when I went back and had a look at the tubers that were left in the ground. We could see this was only just a few months after that fungus had moved in and starting to break it down. So it's providing a source of carbohydrates and nutrition and food for my biology under the ground. And it's really great too because the tillage radish is really good at punching through hard pans. And I wanted to show you this one because this is a paddock, normally has quite a bit of silvergrass and brome and rubbish stuff on it. And in the summertime, it grows really good melons. And you can see them here. And we had a summer rain and all these melons came up. And I thought, well, I better go across and with the motorbike and have a bit of a look so I can get some control happening here in this paddock. And this line here is where I'd split the paddock in half. We had the cover crop on this side. And there's absolutely not one melon that came up. So whether it was to do with root competition, cover, I'd actually windrowed and harvested the cover crop that year to retain some seed. But I just thought that was absolutely amazing, the power of plants. Yeah, so basically this is where I'm at here now, is that, learning from that experience. Oh, the other good thing, which I didn't mention, in those cover crops, just the amount of insects and bugs and critters. There's no disease either. Absolutely amazing how that synergism was happening, that interaction between the different plants, and it's also good to have those pollinators in there as well to attract good insects as well. So and it's something they want to do a lot more of on the farm as well too. But what's really been key to helping me to evaluate the changes is collecting data. And it's really good to do something, but unless you're able to evaluate it and see whether it's making the changes or the correct changes or positive changes is really important too. So, an important part of making changes is actually being able to evaluate it. And so, we're constantly using data to validate the changes. And also to help drive our breeding objectives with our sheep as well too. We've been able to increase the profit per ewe. When we first started, I think our average profit per ewe is under $200. That's influenced by wool prices and lamb prices and sheep prices, of course, but we've now been able to get rid of those ewes that never had a lamb. They'd been managed and looked after. Still cost the same amount to feed them, but they only returned us a fleece, and it might have been a small fleece of low value. So we've been able to identify those ones that are performing as well and get rid of them. So that's helped to reduce our costs, and in many other respects too, it helps to reduce our emissions because we're then only keeping the most profitable and productive animals as well. You can see there that focusing on that profit per ewe, improving our embryo conversion. So after scanning, we know we could have 150% lambs on the ground, and then at marking time we know how many we got, and then we can say, righto, we need to improve X, Y, Z, whether it may be shelter or water or better feed, whatever it may be, because that's the easiest way to make better use of our resources is by increasing our lamb survival. We've already got them, we've just got to get them through to maturity. Concentrating on our pastures, and the other thing that I'm following up is this whole thing to do with soil carbon neutrality and looking for those premiums for carbon neutral produce. And so we continue to keep networking the farm. So we're putting our Wi-Fi, our own Wi-Fi network over the farm, and that then allows us to start doing remote monitoring. We can have up cameras, so we can start to observe animals and the water. And we can start to then also do some sensing as well. We can look at what our soil temperatures are and moisture, etc. So, and it's been great because we're getting rid of the dead spots on the farm as well too. So, I think it's really good. So I'll just quickly flick through some of these slides here. So a lot of the infrastructure on the farm is reaching a point where it's old and needs replacing. So I'm using that to my advantage and putting in some semi-permanent electric fencing. So that may be between two paddocks, so between this paddock and that one. And then that way then you can electrify that main fence and pull hot wires off. And at the same time, I'm now putting in replacement water infrastructure using hydrants or couplings. And a good thing that I found is that by moving the water, I can actually move the sheep across the paddock. So even if I haven't got time to go out there and put up temporary electric fencing, which I'm still working on, I can shift the trough, and I know I can move the sheep across the paddock to force them to graze more of the paddock. So yes, at that I'll hand back, and we'll see what happens from there. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. great presentation. Change is always hard, and it's, you know, something that's inevitable in life, but it's not easy to adapt to, I guess. And I feel like you've got a great attitude towards change, and I think it's important and great that you're asking those questions. You know, you have the curiosity, and that you're not afraid of failure and getting out there and having a go. Like you said, you know, it's not going to be perfect, but you've got to try and you've got to get out there and have a go. So yeah, well done. The results are great.
Thanks, Caitlin. Yeah, no,
No
it's
worries.
fun.
Yeah.
It's filled the day.
I've got a few questions in the chat for you. Of the lower cost risk, cost/risk changes you decided to make to your farm at the start, which ones gave you the most early encouragement to keep making changes? What's been your most important avenue of ongoing support?
For the first one, the biggest bang for buck, I suppose, or the easiest, was actually putting in an auto drafter. I was really hesitant to do that. And Graham Hand, he was at me that I need to put in an auto drafter. And it was funny talking to him just recently. He thought my resistance to doing that was that, you know, I was a bit tight and didn't want to spend the money. When in fact the real reason for it was I just knew how hard it was working with sheep, and I thought trying to do this on my own with a machine, it's not going to work. You know, this is going to be a classic boat anchor. But I was really amazed because we put the auto drafter in, it didn't work to begin with, and I was getting a bit short in the fuse, and the poor old dog, she'd had enough of me and she headed off, and I was on my own. So I actually, while I was sitting there in the shade looking at these sheep, trying to work out how to make the blinking thing work, I noticed the sheep were circling anti-clockwise, and the normal path that we bring the sheep up from sort of requires them to be spinning clockwise. So I brought them up another yard and came through a side gate, and I couldn't believe it. The sheep actually started running up the auto drafter, and you know, I had mixed feelings because you know, I was really happy that it was working, but then I just sort of realised that for 130 years our family had been drafting the sheep the wrong way. But it was great. The payback on the auto draft was fantastic because we were able to identify those animals that were only, you know, failing to get into lamb and only cutting a $40 fleece. We got rid of those, and we made several $1,000s by not having to feed and spend money on those lower profitable sheep. Well, they weren't profitable; they were costing us money. And look, as far as encouragement, there's a whole heap of people out there doing some really extraordinary stuff, and you start chatting to them, and they're a fantastic network. And look, the really good thing about it is by doing something that's simple and easy, it then gives you the encouragement to go try something a little bit more difficult, and it becomes a little bit addictive then, because once you have a good success with something, you think, well, actually, I think I might try this, and then if that works, that's great. If it doesn't work, then you go, oh, maybe I've done it the wrong way, and it's just one of those things that it's a process of growing as well too. I understood that we were handling the sheep wrong. We'd have the hounds of Baskerville on the back of the ute. These salivating dogs would be howling the bark, and then a couple of motorbikes, and we'd scream them in at 30 mile an hour. If they weren't doing 30 mile an hour, they had to do 40. The sheep would be puffed out in the yards, and they'd be stirred up, and you just couldn't do anything with them. But I'm starting to understand that by handling sheep begins in the paddock. You've got to bring them in a quieter way, and then they're a lot easier to handle because they're not stirred up. So, yeah.
Awesome. What are your biggest barriers to being able to earn premiums on your products for their more biodiversity-friendly growing process?
Well, we've just started with it at the moment, but we're doing the redesign. I'm looking at wanting to introduce more trees and creating shelter belts. And we've, it's about 800 trees that we've planted. We try to choose from the, the traditional native trees that are found on the farm. But I really had quite a difficult time trying to get them to survive, especially the tall, spindly ones. That's not very good. So my barrier there is survival, getting the right species of trees, but also then having the infrastructure, setting up the infrastructure, having the time and the money to put in the fencing and so forth. I know Landcare do grants and stuff, but you've still got to get it up. And I just find good help's hard to find too. This year I've got young Eddie helping me out because uni had shut down and he couldn't get to uni, so it's been brilliant. We're getting twice as much done. We're getting stuff done that I've been wanting to do for the last 3 years done this year, so it's fantastic. So it's not just one thing. There's a multitude of different things that are barriers, but if you can address that simplest one and keep working your way up the rung, you'll eventually get the job done. But it's certainly something I want to do is do more planting. But I think it's really important to get those pollinators, those plants that attract the pollinators and the insects back into the system as well too. And I'd like to move away from monocrops into companion crops, companion planting. I can see the benefits of having the mixed species in the covers, and we see it in our pastures. So why shouldn't we see the same thing in our crops?
Yeah, and what are the challenges to you right now for implementing that?
Yeah, probably the number one challenge is rainfall, because I sort of work by the odds a little bit. And, people do it with bookmakers and horse races and footy bets and stuff. Well, I try to do the same thing with the weather, and so I'll try and sort of temper my spending based around what the likely odds are of getting a longer season or even a spring, for example. The weather has a bit to do with it as well too. I'm not sure if that's entirely satisfying the question, but it depends on every year really. Some years, if I can see that things are looking a bit better, well, I'm a bit more confident to go and spend a bit more money or get someone in to help me finish a job or do a job. But otherwise, I'll just say, well, it'll carry over till next year.
Yeah, definitely. No, that answers the question. Thank you. Great presentation. Really enjoyed seeing how this type of agriculture is being applied in the Wimmera. Are there local forums to share learnings in the Wimmera?
I'd have to say most likely. I know the Vic No-Till, they're sort of, they've got Facebook groups going. There's different groups, but fortunately I have to admit on there that I'm not the world's best social media person, and I know I'm joined to different Facebook groups and things, and I'm not making the most of them. I'll be the first one to admit that. But yeah, there are groups out there. You just Google it, go see Dr. Google and ask, and things will occur and pop up and set you in the right point. Otherwise, talk to someone that's 30 years younger than you and they'll tell you what's available, what's around.
Yeah, definitely. And the time and stuff as well behind getting on them in the first place. Like, it's not like you said, sitting on a tractor and listening to a podcast. It's a bit more engagement that needs to happen, I guess.
No, definitely. You only get out of it what you put into it.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you collecting any data related to your perennial pastures and cover crops?
No, but I would like to. With the cover crops, we were talking about this morning, looking at the number of days grazing and the weight gain per animal. So we're sort of doing that at the moment, but I would really like to anecdotally, I can say, yeah, it's hitting the ball out of the park. But I really need to sit down and do that analysis. And that's the other thing, is that I don't have time to do the analysis. And that's where I found a young lass by the name of Elise Bowen, and she does my analysis for me. And she's brilliant, because I can say, here, Elise, this is what I want to work out. Here's the files. And you know, a few hours later or a day or two later, the spreadsheet will turn up my inbox. And, you know, that's something I guess I didn't touch on, is that you need to work with good people, and people who fill in the gaps of the skills that you don't have. You know, I mean, I muck around with Excel and do stuff, but it spends a lot of time. I spend a lot of time on it. And if I can pay somebody to do that, and I can be out doing something else that is improving the farm, I think it's great to be able to do that.
Yeah, definitely. No more questions. There's a lot of comments thanking you for your presentation, and people saying that they learnt a lot and really enjoyed it. And thank you from us as well. It was fantastic hearing from you. So with that, I'd just like to wrap up today with a few more acknowledgements. So once again, I'd like to acknowledge our committee, our sponsors, our speakers for the past 5 weeks. You guys have done some amazing presentations, and I think everyone's gotten a lot of value out of everything that's been talked about so far. So really, really appreciate everybody that accepted the offer to come join us to share their knowledge and experience. I'd like to thank Costa as well, our ambassador, for kicking off our first webinar. I know a lot of people enjoyed his enthusiastic opening and endorsement for this year's seminar. So yeah, thank you, Costa. I'd like to thank Alia Pertle, I think she's online today, also for designing this year's logo. And I'd like to thank Wendy McInnes for our amazing mugs. And of course, to all of you participants, once again, this year, joining us online, being adaptable. You know, it's amazing what you can achieve when you're forced to adapt and change. So yeah, you guys are amazing. In terms of mugs, so we do have 175 this year to give away. So we will be emailing the lucky recipients of those mugs shortly after this webinar to let you know if you will be receiving one. We would appreciate if you guys could spare a couple of minutes just to fill out our participant feedback survey. Just let us know your thoughts on this year's seminar. All of the 5 webinars have been recorded, so if you want to go back and rewatch any, or you missed a couple, you can head to the SwiftVic YouTube channel. They're all available there. Make sure, if you're not following us already, follow us on our social media platforms. That's the best way to keep up with what's happening with the seminar going forward. And yeah, thank you once again to everyone for joining the 24th Wimmera Biodiversity Seminar. We hope that next year, for a quarter of a century, we'll be able to do it together, maybe in a hybrid model, a bit of a face-to-face and potentially digital format as well. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we'll see you next year.